Nobody's volunteering to answer this question. Go ahead. No, you don't need to do that. Once you say present value, you've already taken into account the interest rate or the discount rate, right? So the present value already has that. Your key point was the marginal net benefits, so namely the marginal benefits less the marginal cost. That is the marginal net benefits, right? And those marginal net benefits must be equal across all periods. Otherwise, you don't have the optimum. You don't have the most efficient solution. And if any one period, if its marginal net benefits is much larger than another period, you've got to reallocate the resources among the periods until they're equal. Because only then will you have maximized total net benefits, right? Okay. Let's look at this. Okay, a few definitions. Scarcity rent, once again, it's nothing more than the price that's received less the production cost, and you may want to include a normal return, and it's the same, as I just noted a moment ago, as economic profits. Now, new definition, we haven't talked about this before, switch points. If I have a depletable resource, by definition, somewhere along the line, I'm going to exhaust that amount of available resource. Right? When I do, I have no choice but to turn to a renewable resource. Now, why didn't I make that switch earlier? I didn't make that switch earlier because the low-cost alternative was the exhaustible or depletable resource, which in this case would be fossil fuels. Once we run out of fossil fuels, we have no choice but to move to renewable resources, right? Because there's no longer, presumably, any fossil fuels that are available. Yes?
So this one you have to do with the depletability of the resource, not the environmental degradation of it. There's no marginal cost.
There certainly is a marginal cost, but the switch point would happen actually at one of 2 points. Either we face exhaustibility, or technology's come along and made the renewable resource more efficient, and its cost is now lower than the exhaustible resource, hence it would replace it, all right? Okay, that's the switch point. Price ceiling, we defined this early in our lectures, namely it's the legal upper bound, and the presumption is that the government will enforce this price ceiling, and that no transactions will take place at prices higher than that ceiling. Now, we've talked about user costs a number of times. We're going to make it very precise now. If I am a firm or a company or an individual that's extracting an exhaustible resource, what is the cost that I face? 1, I face the extraction cost, right? And that's crystal clear. 2, I also face the opportunity foregone by using the resource today and not taking advantage of using it at some future point in time. That's its opportunity cost. So the real cost to me as a firm or as somebody managing that scarce resource, the real cost to me is composed of 2 elements. 1, the extraction cost, and 2, the opportunity cost foregone that I could have not used the resource today, but instead used it next year or a decade from now and captured whatever value it had then. Take, for example, let's take a concrete example. Look at the price of gold. The price of gold in 1990 was approximately $300. Now, I could have, if I was a miner and actually owned a gold mine, which would be very nice, but unfortunately I don't. But if I did, I could have extracted that gold in 1990 and sold it for $300 an ounce. However, if I'd waited to today and sold that ounce of gold today, I would be rewarded not with $300, but with $1,700. Right? Now, would it have been worth it to me to forego the current flow in 1990 and wait, how many years is this? 1990, 10, 21, 22 years, right? So, yes, and that is a cost to me of extracting that gold in 1990 and capturing the $300. So yes, it would, because if the interest rate was very high, then that would gravitate toward extracting the gold in 1990 and selling it in 1990, right? But if the interest rate was very low, it would go the other way, right? Interest rate or the discount rate, which are one and the same for the purposes of this course, right? Okay, so we got that. Now, Hotelling's model, do you recall I specify exactly what you are required to know for any future problem sets or the final exam? You have to know that the Hotelling model gives you certain results based on some critical assumptions. And the basic result is for exhaustible or depletable resources, the prices should increase over time, and they should increase in accordance with the rate of interest, given that's your alternative with regard to how you use your scarce resources, savings account rates of interest. And that also provides incentives for conservation. In fact, the way to think about the second component of user cost, namely the opportunity cost of capturing the value at some time in the future, that's sitting there providing incentives to conserve today, right? Because you're going to utilize less of the resource today if there's huge potential value of utilizing that resource well down the road into the future. Okay? Now, what happens when the government comes along and imposes a price ceiling? And they impose that price ceiling for all future periods. What happens to this opportunity cost? Why? It does. I can only get the price today. Because if the price ceiling is constant, that means I can't, by conserving today, capture more value tomorrow. I'm going to capture the same value tomorrow that I can capture today, and as a result, there is no opportunity cost. And because of that, dynamic efficiency would be violated. Yes? Yes, it did. It happened with natural gas. You know, if you can communicate directly with God and determine what a just price is, you don't have to worry about future technology. He'll tell you when he's ready. No, they did not take into account future technology. Okay? Okay, so as a result, there would be too much extraction in the current period, right, under price ceilings, and that would lead to an earlier switch point. Everything else constant, given how I define switch points. And as a result, the owners of the depletable resource won't be able to capture any scarcity rent. And if the price ceiling particularly, it would expect it to get a just price when those regulators are sitting there, they're thinking, gee whiz, what's your marginal cost of extraction? Well, adjust prices. You shouldn't get any more than what your incremental cost of extraction is, right? And that's generally how those prices were set by the regulators. And whenever this policy is put in place, and by the way, this next bullet presumes that the price ceiling or the just price set by the government is not set for the renewable resource, only for the exhaustible resource, which in this case is natural gas. And moreover, this has some consequences for consumers, particularly if there's an abrupt change, because most of us invest in stoves and various appliances that use natural gas. And if it turns out there's suddenly an abrupt change, that's going to impose all sorts of adjustment costs on the consumers that are in the marketplace for purchasing natural gas. All right. Now, what are the impacts of the permanent price controls? First, the cumulative quantity, if there's an earlier switch point, would be less with price controls than without. In the earlier periods, more quantity is going to be extracted because there's no incentive for conservation. The time of transition is earlier under price controls than without the price controls, and you would expect the transition to be abrupt. Now, having said all that, you might respond with, oh, these are all interesting theoretical propositions. Did this in fact happen in natural gas? I don't expect you to be authorities on natural gas. Do you think it actually happened? Pardon? Who said yes? Yes. Yeah, why? They do make sense because they're theoretically sound. They're conceptually sound. But what happened, by the way, we call this an exhaustible resource. Natural gas is an exhaustible resource. But what's happened over the last decade in particular, there's been a whole bunch of new discoveries of natural gas and a new technology. Unfortunately, a technology that's called fracturing that uses high pressure to break apart particles and to access natural gas. North Dakota, South Dakota, the shale production that's taken place in various parts of the country and throughout Canada in particular has increased dramatically. The supply, or what you thought was the exhaustible amount of reserves, has turned out to be much larger today than you thought it was 20 years ago or 10 years ago. And moreover, natural gas prices today, talking about just prices, does anybody know what natural gas prices are per cubic foot today? Let me tell you. 10 years ago, during the Enron crisis here in the state of California, natural gas prices per cubic foot got to $14. Today, the close on the New York Mercantile Exchange was $1.91. Why? The huge increase in natural gas supply. And the other reason is warm weather. And a number of firms are holding inventories of natural gas, and there's been very little demand for it because of all the warm weather throughout the U.S. And now what we, the United States, are attempting to do is to export natural gas on global markets because there's obviously a glut of natural gas here in the United States. Okay, now let's look at what this implies in terms of our standard workhorse, namely a simple graphical analysis of demand and supply. Now, in looking at this particular graph, I want you to focus on this supply curve. S naught, this is the demand curve, this is the willingness to pay, this is the willingness to sell. And if we look at that straight away, we know what total surplus is, right? For that supply curve and that demand curve. What is it? Graphically. Well, break it down. Give me producer and consumer surplus. Go ahead, speak up. A is consumer surplus, is surplus. And the total surplus is A plus B, right? So we'll look at this particular graph. That's a static picture, right? Because it's just one period. In terms of dynamic efficiency, we're not looking at all the periods, we're just looking at the first period and trying to figure out what happens in that first period with regard to the winners and the losers. Namely, are consumers better off because they have more consumer surplus? Are producers worse off because they have less producer surplus? Right? Now, if it turns out that you impose a price ceiling, and given our earlier arguments that once the price ceiling is imposed, there is no opportunity cost that's embedded in current user cost, right? We all agree on that? So that means the marginal cost facing a user of that resource in the first period is everywhere lower than it would be without price ceilings, correct? Are you with me? If you're not, then stop me. Okay, as a result, if it turns out there are price ceilings, the relevant supply curve is not S naught, but it's SI. Because it's only the extraction costs that matter in the incentives for a producer of natural gas who is facing a market with price ceilings. Okay? All right, let's look at the subsequent. An efficient market would be the maximization of total surplus. It would be A plus B, and you can call that total surplus or total net benefit. It's synonymous. Right? Now, the price ceiling that would be imposed would reduce the marginal user cost, and if that price ceiling is made constant through the entire future, then there is no opportunity cost. And the only cost that would matter is the extraction cost, and thus the supply curve would shift from S naught to S subscript I. Okay? Yes?
And that's maximizing total surplus again, right? There's more.
Right.
Does it make the entire market more efficient?
No, on the contrary. It certainly is going to end up with current consumers being better off. But what happens to future consumers? Yes, exactly. And under these circumstances, we would end up with more current production than we would or in a world in which there are price ceilings. Okay? Consumers, they're clearly, coming back to Gabe's question, consumers in the short run, in the current period, are clearly better off because their consumer surplus was what before? It was A plus B? Yes, now it's A plus B plus C. They're actually picking up more surplus in the current period. But future consumers are going to be worse off because they're going to face an earlier switch point, and presumably, unless there's some major technological progress on renewable energy, they're going to end up paying higher prices in the future after the switch. Producers, it would appear that they too could gain depending on the size of D, the area D, versus the area B. But in the long run, they clearly are not better off. And the reason they're not is because they don't capture any of the scarcity rents. So even though in the first period, they may end up being slightly better off in the world in which there are price ceilings versus the world in which there isn't price ceilings, it depends on the elasticities of demand and supply, but clearly they're going to be worse off in the long run. Right? Okay. And here I think that's that very point, namely when there's a loss in the scarcity rent, the producers, are unambiguously worse off. Okay? So the summary. In the current periods, price controls might benefit current consumers and producers, but in the long run, future consumers and producers will be worse off because too much is extracted in the earlier periods. And as a result, society will capture less of the total potential net benefit in a world in which there are price controls because the fundamental rule of dynamic efficiency will be violated. And the total net benefit as a result will not be maximized. Okay? All right. Let's turn to crude oil. And to motivate our discussion in crude oil, one of the most important players in the global market for crude oil is OPEC. And OPEC historically has attempted to use their market power to capture more of the rents. Noting all the while that there is a ceiling on what kind of monopoly profits they can capture. I don't know if you follow the popular press, but if you listen to the leaders of Saudi Arabia, what do they say the right price is for crude oil? Does anybody know? I mean, they are a major producer of crude oil, right? And you would have thought that they would look at the current price and say, gee whiz, I want that price to be as high as possible, right? Because I'm going to make much more in the way of profits. So why, for example, would they want a price that is lower than the maximum price they could capture? Yes, Justin? Say what? But if the price is much higher, why would people use more? The demand curve is downward sloping. If the price is much higher, they would use less, wouldn't they? Oh, okay. If the price, that's certainly true. And doesn't that turn on what is the price elasticity of demand? Right? Now, if the price was very inelastic, then the quantity reduction in consumption wouldn't be that much, right? So they wouldn't care about the reduced quantity if demand is very inelastic. And it turns out it is, right? In the short run, not in the long run. Okay. Saudi Arabia has come out and made the statement that they think the right price for crude oil is $100 a barrel. Right? And if you really unravel that, why in the world would they make that sort of statement? As the price of crude oil goes up, it creates more and more incentives for investment in R&D and technological progress to advance renewable energy. The best incentive is not governmental dictates coming from our current executive branch about renewable energy. The best incentive is that if crude oil prices were much higher, then there would be much more value to be captured by innovative startup companies that find real solutions for converting cellulosic feedstocks into biofuels, for example. Okay, that's an aside. Effective. Okay, now with regard to OPEC, whether or not their attempt to control the global market for crude oil, whether that's effective depends on a few key economic relationships. One, the price elasticity of demand for OPEC oil. Two, the income elasticity of demand for oil. And three, what is the competitive responses of the non-OPEC suppliers of crude oil on global markets? And who are those non-OPEC members? There are a number. Norway is one non-OPEC member. Russia, surprisingly enough, is another. And so is the U.S. And it also depends upon the compatibility or the alignment of incentives among different countries that are members of OPEC. In fact, when OPEC broke down seriously, there was real incompatibility between Iraq and Iran. Why? Because they were in a major war with one another as a way of dominating your economic interest. So, given those facts, let's look at the historical evolution of crude oil prices. Up until 1973, crude oil prices were very stable and at low levels. Hence, there was no incentive for developing alternative renewable sources because it wasn't commercially competitive with crude oil. And then along comes the Yom Kippur War, and OPEC is formed, and there's an embargo imposed by all OPEC countries, namely they won't export crude oil to the United States. You're all too young. None of you were around in 1973, were you? I happened to be at the time at the University of Chicago, and the queues at gas stations, there were as many as 300 cars waiting to get gas. The embargo had a serious impact. There was no crude oil that refiners could use to make into gasoline, and as a result, there was a real scarcity. And at the time, the Nixon administration responded with this by imposing price ceilings, which made even more rationing take place. The rest of the 1990s, some of the non-OPEC countries made major discoveries, in particular Norway and the North Sea, and they began to supply global markets. In 1986, prices fell dramatically to $12.52 per barrel. In 89-90, it spiked briefly due to the first Gulf War, but then fell back to $10. And then from 1999 through 2008, the crude oil price globally steadily increased, peaking at $142 in 2008. And then with the recession, most people refer to it as the Great Recession, not just the recession, the Great Recession, because it didn't quite spill over into a characterization of a depression. But during that period, crude oil prices fell dramatically to $50, and they fell even more through early 2009, down to the high 30s. Right? Today, West Texas Intermediate is $100